Wonderful. Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Kathryn Chelminski. I'm here with Lisa Schwartz and Grace Relf from Berkeley Lab. Welcome to the fourth of 5 webinars this year on Distributed Energy Resources Interconnection Roadmap, recently published by the U.S. Department of Energy's Interconnection Innovation Exchange, I2X. The roadmap identifies a wide range of solutions to address challenges for interconnecting energy resources to distribution and subtransmission grids. I2X advances open dialogue among diverse stakeholders on interconnection challenges, bridges knowledge gaps, and supports practical solutions. DOE's Interconnection Innovation Exchange is supported by Berkeley Lab to help advance solutions identified in the roadmap. In addition to this webinar series, we're conducting studies on interconnection timelines, costs, automation of interconnection processes, allocation of interconnection costs, and using innovative technologies to evolve interconnection procedures. We're also developing a publicly available web portal to provide DER interconnection queue data from across the US and providing training and technical assistance for state agencies. Today, our focus is on promoting economic efficiency and interconnection through cost sharing. The allocation of interconnection costs for DER has traditionally followed a cost causer pays model. As DER penetration grows, states are testing new cost allocation practices for upgrades to distribution systems for timely and fair interconnection that also improve economic efficiency. Today, we have presentations by Grace Relf at Berkeley Lab, Kate Tohme at New Leaf Energy, Brian Ritzinger at the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, Arthur O'Donnell from the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, and Ron Nelson from Current Energy Group. We will then kick off Q&A with the panelists and answer your questions and comments. We have 2 hours, so plenty of time for discussion. First, some housekeeping items. This meeting is being recorded. Slides for today's presentation are posted. We'll put the link in the chat box, and a recording will be posted there soon. Please enter questions for panelists anytime in the Q&A box. We'll take clarifying questions after the presentations and hold the majority of questions until all presentations are done. Feel free to put your comments in the chat box at any time. The DOE I2X DR interconnection roadmap provides a guide of actions to take over the next 5 to 10 years to implement solutions designed to address DER interconnection challenges. The focus of this webinar is increasing economic efficiency through cost allocation through the following solutions: group study processes, pro rata cost sharing, grid export tariffs, and proactively upgrading distribution circuits through grid modernization processes. To learn more about the I2X events and resources, you can scan the QR code in the slide here or use the link provided, and we'll also share that in the chat box. Coming up, we have our 5th and final webinar in this series on the topic of maintaining a reliable, resilient, and secure grid, which will be planned for December. Lastly, we just wanted to remind you that DOE also published a 5-year transmission interconnection roadmap, which details key solutions and goals to improving interconnection. With that, I will turn it over to Grace Relf, who will start off our presentations. Thanks, Grace.
Thank you. Pulling up my slides here. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Grace Relf. I am a policy researcher at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and I'm excited to be kicking off this conversation today. I am here today really to help set the stage for this conversation amongst our fantastic experts and practitioners who are actually living this on the ground. I'm going to provide just a bit of background on cost allocation and specifically why we're talking about it in the context of DER interconnection. And then I'm going to just talk through some of the approaches that we're seeing on the ground to date, where states have been working to update their cost allocation approaches. And then I'm excited to turn it over to our panelists who will have much more in-depth information for you to share. All right, so just a bit of background here. So there's actually a great body of research and literature on electric utility cost allocation, including these two manuals here on your screen. Back in 1992, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC, put out this electricity utility cost allocation manual, and it's really a foundational document that outlines practices and implementation for conducting cost allocation for electric utilities. More recently, RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project, put out a guide for cost allocation in this new era of the electricity system. And it builds on those foundational concepts and provides some thinking on how to update those for our new era. To determine how to divide up costs, cost allocation really asks what was causing these costs, or why were they incurred, and who is benefiting from those costs, or who is actually kind of using the equipment or using the infrastructure funded by those costs. And while this may seem straightforward, in the end, as you'll see in this quote here, in the end, cost allocation may be more of an art than a science.
Grace, are your slides advancing? We're getting a couple questions from panelists
I'm
or
seeing
from
them
the audience.
advance. Are you not?
We're still seeing the first slide.
Still seeing the first slide. Okay, let me just try to share again. Apologies for that. Okay, are you seeing the agenda slide there?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, and let's make sure these advance. Are those advancing for you?
Still seeing agenda.
Okay, well, I can, let's see, I will put this as large as it can go.
Kathryn, you could show the slides.
Is that
Yeah,
working
I'm
for you?
gonna, no, let me try to pull them up 1 second.
Okay, thanks. That's weird. We were working earlier.
All right, are you seeing the agenda slide?
Perfect. Yeah, and you could go to the next slide. Over to the, yep, perfect. Okay, and one more slide. So as we were just saying, in the end, cost allocation really is more of an art and a science than a science, and there are a lot of decisions that go into doing good cost allocation and making sure that it is fairly assigning costs. So RAP's guide notes that cost allocation practices may need to be updated in order to keep pace with the modern electric system and how rapidly it's changing. To determine why costs were incurred and who is benefiting from them, we now have much better data to be able to help make those decisions. But we're also seeing that those decisions are becoming more complex. So for example, we have new ways of using resources, and we are seeing prices change for different kinds of resources, and we're seeing new resources altogether come online. Additionally, new technologies are serving multiple purposes where in the past they may have had more straightforward functions. For example, metering infrastructure in the past was traditionally classified as customer related, really driven by the number of customers, whereas today, those smart meters, new technologies around metering, can really help to manage energy and might be more demand or energy and customer related. So lots of different functions that these technologies can serve. So taking a fresh look at how we're allocating costs to customer classes or to individual customers can help support the objective of cost allocation to fairly assign costs across customer classes. Next slide. For DER interconnection, this is increasingly important and really the subject of our webinar today. So when DERs connect to the grid, the utility needs to assess whether that resource can safely and reliably interconnect, or whether the utility needs to invest in infrastructure to help accommodate that resource. This can mean upgrading substations, transformers, distribution lines, to different types of infrastructure that can be quite costly. In a typical cost allocation approach, which we would call a cost causer pays model, the DER project that initially triggers the need for that grid upgrade, so that first project that requests interconnection and triggers the need for the project, is assigned responsibility for the full cost of those upgrades. In the US DOE's interconnection roadmap, they identify cost allocation as a really important solution to improving the overall interconnection process. And some states out there have already been exploring this for a number of years to make sure that we are able to assign costs to those that are benefiting and really not just using that cost causer pay models where we might miss assigning costs to customers that are actually using that infrastructure. Early movers on this have really been in states where we are already seeing grid constraints caused by interconnection or increasing adoption of grid edge resources. And so we are trying to learn from those early experiences as we go through this. Next slide. So there are a number of challenges with this traditional cost causer pay models. First, as we just talked about, when the first DER that triggers that upgrade pays for 100% of the costs, it allows subsequent interconnecting customers or DERs to benefit from that upgrade without paying for it, and that's called free ridership. The cost causer pay model can also exacerbate uncertainty about the costs that you will be charged in order to interconnect. For example, it could lead to, you might submit multiple speculative applications for projects just to understand your cost responsibility, because you might not be sure about whether you'll be charged for all or none of the upgrade. Those speculative applications can also increase delays in the interconnection process, lead to lengthy queues, and cause challenges there. Of course, that assignment of full costs to one customer can be exorbitant and lead to customers abandoning planned DER projects because they're not able to finance their project based on those high interconnection costs. Another issue here is that when we conduct cost allocation for load and DER energy exports differently, we might be missing opportunities to incentivize the utility to do timely interconnection because DERs can ultimately erode utility revenue. And so we want to kind of better align those cost allocation approaches for load and DER energy exports. And then finally, when you're looking at interconnection just on an individual basis, you might be missing beneficiaries who are benefiting from upgraded DER interconnections. For example, additional loads coming online who might be able to use that hosting capacity. And so you might be misassigning costs or missing beneficiaries who are not assigned those costs. Next slide. So here are just a few approaches that we're seeing to changes in cost allocation for DER interconnection. On the right, I've got a list of cost allocation approaches in practice. And each of those are kind of made up of these cost allocation approaches, which and implementation details surrounding cost recovery, identifying different upgrade needs, and other complementary tactics as well. So cost allocation can take a number of different forms. It could be a direct assignment. So customers are paying in full for specific assigned costs. That could be the cost causer pay models where you're assigned all of the costs for upgrades, or you might just be assigned specific costs for those that are particular to your own resource. Fixed fees can look like a flat fee or like $1 per system to cover certain costs. Those could be pooled to help cover costs, upgrade costs for all customers that are interconnecting. So for example, a $300 per system interconnection fee for small systems is an example of that. An emerging approach that we're seeing is pro rata cost allocation, where interconnecting customers pay for a proportional share of use of upgraded equipment. Usually that looks like $1 per kilowatt or $1 per megawatt fee for your use of the equipment. And then we also see that some costs get assigned to all ratepayers through the rate base. And in those approaches, states are usually using a traditional revenue requirement and cost allocators to assign those costs. So as I mentioned, in practice, these are typically used in conjunction with one another. You might have some costs assigned to ratepayers and use a pro rata allocation for interconnecting customers. And then the important considerations here also include whether the upgrade need is triggered by interconnection requests or through a proactive planning process. Whether you might be able to initially mitigate costs and reduce the need to allocate costs to certain customers through phased interconnections or flexible interconnections that aim to make better use of the distribution system to allow DERs to interconnect at lower cost. And then how those costs will be recovered is really important as well. Are you collecting those costs upfront from ratepayers and having subsequent interconnecting customers pay those back over time? Or are you collecting costs upfront from interconnecting customers right away? So these examples on the right, you'll hear more about from our panelists over, and I'm excited to hear them dig more into those as well. Go to the next slide. So just to kind of close out here, Berkeley Lab is conducting research on these different approaches. We're hoping to catalog different state and utility efforts to improve cost allocation for DER interconnection and really provide useful tools and lessons to practitioners to help you all improve your practices. Initial findings while this is underway is that this really is an important piece of the puzzle to mitigate bottlenecks on local grids and help deploy resources in a timely manner and to fairly assign costs. However, lessons are still underway. We're really trying to, some of these efforts are still nascent. And so we're collecting initial lessons as we go. Importantly, the approaches that we're seeing out there in the world do differ based on, the types of resources, the sizes of resources. So for example, residential rooftop solar approaches might look very different than for customer or community scale resources. To help improve these processes, effective working groups have been really helpful to improve dialogue and streamline the process once you do get to that formal phase. And those complementary approaches that I mentioned, like holistic planning, thinking about cost transparency, and reducing or mitigating interconnection costs overall, can really be helpful to improve and smooth the way to these cost allocation approaches. Well, I will leave it there, and thank you all, and I look forward to hearing from our panelists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Grace. So next up, we have Kate Tohme. Kate, do you want to come on video? Great. And you can go ahead and share your slides. Kate Tohme is the Director of Interconnection Policy with New Leaf Energy. Thanks so much, Kate.
Hi, thank you. Can you see my slides all right?
Yes, perfect. Thanks.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Very excited to be part of this webinar. I am the Director of Interconnection Policy at New Leaf Energy. New Leaf is a renewable energy developer. We work across the country, both at the distribution and utility scale level, developing solar, energy storage, wind, and some electric vehicles. And prior to joining New Leaf Energy, I was working in Massachusetts at the Department of Public Utilities for the better part of a decade as a hearing officer, chief of staff, and DG and clean energy ombudsperson. So at New Leaf Energy, I work exclusively on the distribution side on interconnection policy. So as you can imagine, cost allocation is very relevant there. And I've also spent a significant amount of time thinking about cost allocation in Massachusetts with Brian. And now, since I've been at New Leaf Energy, thinking about that across the country. So a couple of these slides in here are somewhat overlapping with Grace's, so I'm going to fly through them, but just want to make sure that we're level setting, why we're having this conversation. Our distribution system was built to distribute energy. And now that we have a need for alternative energy resources, we're asking the system to redistribute that energy. So as we redistribute the energy, each of the utilities that are having distributed generation come online at the distribution level have to conduct impact studies to ensure that the system will still be safe and reliable once the distributed generation facility is online. With that, we need to modernize our grid in order to accommodate this new ask that we're making of the distribution system. When we were first bringing renewable energy online, that was not as significant of an ask because the upgrades that were necessary to the distribution system infrastructure were minimal, and so the costs of those upgrades were sustainable for one facility. As we have greater saturation of distributed generation on the distribution system, the infrastructure upgrades that we need are getting greater and greater. And we're also seeing the triggering of infrastructure upgrades that would benefit the overall electric distribution system, both distribution customers and interconnecting DG customers. So reactive versus proactive. You're going to hear a lot today about the difference between these two states. Right now, with cost causation, we're in a reactive state. This is the state of affairs that's most common across the country. And that means that when a distributed generation facility submits an interconnection application to the electric distribution company, it might trigger the need for an infrastructure upgrade. So we are reacting to a request for a distributed generation facility to come online. That's where cost causation falls. It's in this reactive measure. Many of the cost allocation approaches you'll hear today are in this reactive state. This reactive state results in timeline delays, lack of regulatory certainty, and also we're reacting to development driven by DG versus reacting to what might be most strategic for modernizing our grid. So I must get on my soapbox just for a minute and preach that I believe where we should all be headed eventually is to the proactive state. And that proactive state is where we are modeling and forecasting for the electric power system as a whole and looking how we need to modernize our grid in order to meet new circumstances and meet our state's clean energy mandates. So in the proactive state, we're identifying need of infrastructure upgrades, both for generation and load. And then we're constructing those infrastructure upgrades in advance of that reactive need. In the proactive state, we have regulatory certainty of timing and costs. We can cost share over time in a service territory, and we can also provide siting signals that are driven by what could be beneficial, most beneficial to the state versus just where development is already occurring. All right. Another very quick level setting is that there are different types of costs for a distributed generation facility coming online. We've got the point of interconnection costs. Those are the location-specific costs, the ones that are specific just to the facility and are not upgrading the larger electric power system. Then we have the common system modifications. Those are where we're upgrading infrastructure upgrades to the larger distribution grid that may benefit multiple distributed generation facilities and potentially distribution customers as well. And then we've got common neighborhood modifications is what I'm calling this. And that's where we have, say, a smaller facility, a residential homeowner who is putting solar on their home, but they trigger the need for a neighborhood transformer, a transformer that would help others, load and generation in their neighborhood, but because of cost causation, they're triggering the need for it. These are different levels of complexity. So Grace got into this. I'm not going to stick on this slide very long, but we have cost causation. That's when we could afford triggering that reactive need, one facility 100%. When we get to the next level, we have more complex infrastructure upgrades where we need to share those costs amongst distributed generation interconnecting customers that are going to benefit. And finally, the third level, that's where we have really high DG saturation, and we're triggering these infrastructure upgrades that are going to benefit the entire electric power system, load and generation. And that's when we start to think about multi-beneficiary pays, where everyone who's going to benefit from the upgrade pays their pro rata share, both distribution customers and DG interconnecting customers. This is just another way of representing the different types of cost allocation methodologies that we've seen across the country. Grace had a slide just like this, so I'm not going to go through them. But what I am going to talk about today in more detail is this reactive prorated cost sharing. That's what is occurring in New York and what we're working on in Minnesota. And I'm going to go into some more detail on what that looks like. And before we move on, reactive cost allocation. There are methodologies across the country, and you're going to hear through the presentations today about, in detail about a few of these. And this is just kind of a national review, so you can have it at your fingertips if you'd like to take a look at this presentation. Got links in here so that you can get some more details if you're interested. But you can see that, we have quite a few different methodologies that are coming about, but what's represented here is actually, a small portion of the country, as you can imagine. So we've got a long way to go and a lot of different places where we can think about what would be best applicable in the different locations. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about New York's cost sharing and what we're working on in Minnesota and what some other states are thinking about right now as well, which is the reactive prorated cost sharing. So what that means is that when an infrastructure upgrade is triggered, instead of just the interconnecting customer that triggered the upgrade paying for the cost, we're going to share the cost amongst all distributed generation customers that are going to benefit from it. So the distributed generation customers that are enabled to interconnect by that infrastructure upgrade are going to pay their pro rata costs. And by pro rata, I mean their share of the pie, right? So if we have an infrastructure upgrade that's going to enable 100 megawatts, if your facility is going to use 10 of those megawatts, then you're going to pay for your 10% of that cost. So in New York, there was a New York cost sharing 1.0, and that was where the triggering facility paid for 100% of the costs, and then they were refunded when distributed generation customers came online over a period of time and paid their pro rata share and were refunded to the triggering project. New York Cost Sharing 2.0, which we're focusing on today, is the full reactive prorated cost share methodology, where even the triggering facility is only paying for their pro rata cost of the share. The New York Cost Sharing 2.0 actually has two aspects. There's a market-initiated upgrade and a utility-initiated upgrade. They're both based on this pro rata cost methodology, but I'm going to explain the difference. So first, we're going to talk about the market-initiated upgrade. The market-initiated upgrade is when an interconnection customer submits an application and triggers the need for an infrastructure upgrade. So when they trigger the need for this infrastructure upgrade, if it's an eligible upgrade, then there is a mobilization threshold. So we must have enough interconnecting customers coming online to pay for a certain percentage of the infrastructure upgrade. And once that percentage is met, the utility can move forward with constructing the upgrade. And then any facility that comes on, any distributed generation interconnecting customer facility that comes online after that in the next 5 years that is enabled to interconnect by that infrastructure upgrade will pay for their pro rata cost of the upgrade. Here we've got a table that's straight from the New York SIR, and this is where we see the difference based on type of infrastructure upgrade. The type of infrastructure upgrade is different based on what the triggering project and the sharing project is going to do, and also difference in the mobilization threshold, and the mobilization threshold is directly tied to refundability as well. All right. The other aspect of New York Cost Sharing 2.0, we've got utility-initiated upgrades. So here we're leaning a little bit towards the proactive side, but we're still reacting to interconnecting applications. In the utility-initiated upgrades in New York, the utility can identify an area where they see a lot of interconnection applications coming in, or where they expect a lot of interconnection application coming in, and they expect there to be constraints on a substation transformer bank installation or replacement. And then they can tag this as a capital investment project and file it with the Public Utility Commission, the DPS in New York, and seek to have it approved as a utility-initiated upgrade, whereby they will receive approval for cost recovery. They'll move forward with construction of the upgrade, and then every interconnecting customer that comes online after that will be paying for their pro rata share. Minnesota. So that we're through New York. In Minnesota, there was a law passed that directed the Minnesota to establish a reactive cost sharing methodology, and it was based upon the New York pro rata methodology. But there's a lot of flexibility to conform that methodology to what works best in Minnesota, and also to try to learn from what's happening in New York and other states to make it the most efficient process. There was a working group that was formed, which I participated in. There were 11 meetings, and we came up with a set of draft standards. That set of draft standards was filed with the commission. A notice was issued in September seeking comments, and it's now open for comment discussion, and there will likely be a commission agenda meeting in the new year. The draft standards in Minnesota are similar to the pro rata cost allocation methodology in New York, but they do differ in several ways. And I've listed here some of the top differences. They have different proposed mobilization thresholds and refundability measures, a different annual rolling cap. They propose cost certainty measures, such as a cost envelope. And they also propose a prioritization method for the first round of infrastructure upgrades because there are such large queues already existing on potentially eligible infrastructure upgrades. All right, with that, I will turn it over to everyone else. Unfortunately, I'm unable to stay for the entirety of the webinar. So Kathryn, I'm not sure if you wanted to do a few questions or wait until after presentations.
Thanks so much, Kate. Really great presentation. Lisa, do we have any clarifying questions for Kate?
No, I think we can move on.
Okay, great. Thanks so
Great.
much.
Well, thank you, everyone. And my information is on my PowerPoint. So if you would like to reach out at any time, I'm always happy to continue this conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you. All right, now turning to Brian Ritzinger, Director of Clean Energy and Resilience Engineering with the Massachusetts DPU. Brian, do you want to share your slides?
Yes, thank you very much, Kathryn. Give me 1 second, please. How are you? Can you see everything?
Looks great, thanks.
Okay, fantastic. So good afternoon, everybody, or morning, really, depending on where you are right now. Hope the sound of my voice finds you safe and well. My name is Brian Ritzinger, and I had the pleasure of working with Kate Tohme when she was at the Department of Public Utilities, and I greatly miss her, but I am happy to see her on these webinars and when we get to kind of co-present here. But as Kathryn mentioned, I am the Director of the Clean Energy and Resilience Engineering Division at the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, and the DPU is thankful for the opportunity to present at today's webinar. Okay, so as I kind of continue the conversation regarding cost causation and cost sharing and cost allocation, cost causation is the default cost allocation methodology when interconnecting DG or DER in Massachusetts. There are some exceptions, and those exceptions are group study and the provisional program, which I'll discuss a bit later on. Group study is defined in each of the EDCs, and that's electric distribution companies, DG interconnection tariff. In Massachusetts, there are 3 EDCs. Those are National Grid, Eversource, and Unitil. And by way of background, the DPU approved a 12-month pilot program in 2015. And in 2017, the 3 EDCs filed model revisions to the DG interconnection tariff to make group study permanent. The DPU approved the revisions subject to modifications in 2020 via order in DPU 17-164. The provisional program is where the DPU began investigating an investigation into the EDCs for 1, their DER planning, and 2, their assignment and recovery of costs for the interconnection of DG, and that was in docket DPU 20-75. So DPU 20-75. The DPU investigated both short-term DG interconnection concerns regarding projects already in the queue that could not afford to interconnect based on costs proposed through cost causation and standard group study avenues. The DPU also began investigating a long-term system planning process, also known as the LTSPP. However, that part of the investigation was preempted by the passage of legislation in 2022, which directed the filing of the electric sector modernization plans, also referred to as the ESMPs, and which I'll discuss more later. In docket 20-75, the department established the Provisional System Planning Program, and we'll discuss that further on my next slide. So for the provisional program, it allows the EDCs to file capital investment project proposals also referred to as CIPs, with the DPU. These proposals limit the interconnection costs allocated to each DG facility, and under the provisional design, ratepayers will help fund the initial construction of these EPS upgrades. Ratepayers will be reimbursed over time from fees charged to future DG facilities that are able to interconnect due to the prior upgrades. The DPU reviews CIPs on a case-by-case basis for approval, denial, or modification. And again, as we continue our conversation on the next slide, my slide is not advancing, please bear with me. We will discuss the provisional program eligibility criteria. So while the DPU established a $500 per kilowatt threshold fee, it must be, the DPU established a $500 per kilowatt CIP threshold fee in DPU 20-75-B in our initial ESMP order, which extended the provisional program. We acknowledge that the changing landscape since we first established the provisional program, including increased costs. As such, we stated that if the EDCs proposed a CIP fee greater than $500 per kW, it must be accompanied by sufficient documentation demonstrating that A, an explanation for and the factors responsible for a CIP fee in excess of the $500 per kilowatt, and B, the willingness of developers to proceed with their projects at the higher CIP fee. The DPU has approved 9 CIPs thus far. The first of which, DPU 22-47, Marion Fairhaven, was approved in December of 2022, and 2 phases of group study projects have paid their CIP fees. The following 8 CIPs were approved approved conditionally, meaning if more than 50% of the triggering group study capacity withdrew from the queue prior to paying their initial 25% payment, then the EDC must make a supplemental filing with the DPU showing good cause to move forward with the cost recovery. Eversource and National Grid have each made supplemental filings for 2 conditionally approved CIPs, and these filings are currently under review by the DPU. Further, National Grid recently filed a tariff waiver proposal for a more flexible payment schedule than what was approved through order by the DPU for interconnecting customers to make their CIP fee payments. The waiver filing allows for 75% of the CIP fee payments to be split into 3 installments due at the construction start for distribution lines, construction start for substation upgrades, and construction midpoint. The tariff waiver is docketed as DPU 25-119, and the DPU approved it on October 16th of this year. Moving on to our next slide, we'll discuss our long-term system planning process. The EDCs contend, in DPU 20-75, the DPU investigated the possibility, as I mentioned earlier, of establishing an optimal long-term system planning process. That long-term system planning process was preempted due to the passage of legislation. However, upon the passage of the 2022 Clean Energy Act, the legislator enacted a new process and requirements for long-term system electric planning that effectively replaced the DPU's investigation in DPU 2075. EDCs contend that the proactive hosting capacity fee is based on the principles of beneficiary pays, sound development signals, and cost efficiency. It is intended to promote equitable distribution of costs between DER facilities and ratepayers, and the EDCs will assess the PHC fee to applicable DER facilities that reflect facilities' pro rata share of the necessary common infrastructure costs associated with proactive hosting capacity enablement. To recover the cost of LTSPP investments, the EDCs proposed a long-term system planning factor, or LTSPF, as a non-bypassable reconciling charge. And as we move to our slide 6, our common system modification fee. There's other states that have significant amounts of DG saturation on their system. Some of them have been discussed already on this call, but Massachusetts is definitely up there. I don't think it's a surprise when people hear that Massachusetts has spent a bunch of time in developing DG and DERs across the Commonwealth. And that has led to some challenges for sure. That has led to us having an absolutely saturated system. We are now in a process where we have significant studies that are undertaken for many projects. And we're trying to navigate this as we also further our transition off of natural gas and electrify our system. We are a bit of a victim of our own success. We in other states like Massachusetts, because of our high DG saturation, that even small systems are triggering the need for a transformer upgrade. Oftentimes, the cost of a transformer upgrade would be too much for a residential homeowner or other small facility owner to be able to afford and could kill the project. Now, when I say small, currently the threshold for the simplified process is 15 kW on a single phase, though there is a proposal before us to increase that to 25 kilowatts. And with that, I've concluded my presentation. I did include some additional slides that folks can review afterwards in the appendix that include alternative forms of cost allocation for the interconnection of DER and pending proceedings before the DPU. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Brian. Great presentation. All right, we'll be turning now to Arthur O'Donnell, Senior Technical Advisor with the New Mexico Public Relations Commission. Arthur, you can share your slides now.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Arthur O'Donnell. I am a special advisor to the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, which means I'm not an employee. I was for a time the Director of Policy Administration, but then spouse and I moved back to San Diego and I couldn't be a state employee anymore, but I am under contract. I want to use this disclaimer, which is that while this presentation is based on decisions and actions of the New Mexico PRC, any opinions or anything that even sounds like an opinion is my own and should not be considered as positions of the PRC or any of the commissioners, right? We have a couple of issues that are in play, and of course we have to be careful about what we say about those if they're currently under consideration. Okay. We're going back about 4.5 years now, and the whole concept of cost sharing for interconnection upgrades was first raised when we were trying to update the interconnection rule for distributed energy resources that are smaller than 10 megawatts. At the time, people who were just trying to put rooftop solar were being told by the utilities that their lines were saturated, that they would need significant upgrades, and the utility had no interest in upgrading at that time, right? Because of level of demand, which was relatively small compared to the other big states that you'll be hearing from today. While we were in the process of the interconnection rule update, the legislature passed the Community Solar Act, which complicated things by bringing in interest from all around the country in developing these larger projects up to 5 megawatts and realizing that our utility system really could not handle that. So we began a conversation. We're looking at New York at first, but we're never really able to put a policy in place in interconnection except to allude to a Grid Modernization Act that the legislature had passed in the previous year that allowed for projects that upgraded the grid for a number of purposes. And so what we could get away with at that time, because there was rather vociferous opposition from the utilities, was alluding to the Grid Modernization Act and saying, we'll develop the policies for cost sharing in that act and the rule about that act. We never got there. Instead, what we did was kind of open the door just a little bit to allow for cost sharing among multiple developers, all utility ratepayers under certain circumstances, or among classes. But it would have to align with the statutory goals of the Grid Modernization Act. And while we thought that we would be moving towards that, our grid modernization rule is really has changed into a grid planning, which is certainly currently under consideration. So the Community Solar Act opened the door to 200 megawatts. And so we had an influx of 49 projects that were selected out of some 400 bidders, all of which were seeking interconnection, which led to some real serious issues with regard to what it costs to interconnect to the utility. More recently, the commission expanded that capacity with another 300 megawatts, although we're currently in the process of making the rules to allow for a solicitation and for incorporating that 300 megawatts. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the future. It does include a section on cost sharing. Okay, so the interconnection rule allowed for sharing costs among multiple subscriber organizations. They are the people that organize community solar subscriptions, right? The customers who are moving to community solar, for spreading across all utility ratepayers, for charging only certain rate classes. So this is very familiar with what we had, but it really depends on a public benefits analysis. And the costs can be shared with non-subscribing ratepayers if the benefits they receive are equal to or greater than the cost. So we have kind of a policy, but it really isn't very well flushed out. What's happened is that developers find themselves in a situation where one or more may be using the same utility facilities and are each getting a bill for as much as $10 million for transformer upgrades if necessary. So two of the developers last year found themselves behind another project in the queue and were told that their upgrade costs would exceed $10 million. They petitioned the commission for cost sharing approval, saying that these upgrades would be cost prohibitive and will probably kill the projects. Interestingly, the commission determined that it was not necessary to act on that petition because such cost sharing was already contemplated in the interconnection rule. The petitioners have the capacity to enter these agreements without approval of the commission. The petition was dismissed as moot, but it still allowed the parties to come back and ask for an actual order if for some business or financial reason they required that. And this was determined in September in the docket 25-00058. Now, there was a separate filing in which the commission approved a variance of the IX rule, the interconnection rule, on behalf of the Southwest the SPS utility, and it would allow for a cluster impact study on this. Once again, the commission said, we don't have to act on this variance, right? They did grant it, but basically they said that the mechanism for doing this is already there if all the parties agree. And in this case, all of the parties, the developers and the utility, agreed on doing that. Our last word is that the study is underway and work is beginning on the facility study after the utility has obtained preliminary estimates. So we should be hearing something about that in the future. So while these outcomes are favorable to petitioners, the cases don't resolve the bigger issue. So we have kind of deferred into the current rulemaking, which we're kind of moving towards a formalized process for updating the community solar rule in order to accommodate those 300 megawatts, but also deal with some residual issues that were not addressed in the initial rule. Like all of the other efforts, we're just reifying that the commission must find public benefits using the grid modernization rule criteria before approving cost sharing for interconnection, right? So if you can show that you meet one of or more of the 7 criteria that the legislature had set out for approval of utility grid modernization, you could also be qualified for some level of cost sharing on that. We haven't had any test cases yet, but the commission will affirm that non-subscribing ratepayers can only share if they receive equal to or better benefits, right? So that there is not unfair subsidization of the community solar program. Okay, where we are is the NMPRC expects to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking. We have a workshop special meeting scheduled for November 6th to review all the proposed changes. It's essentially a wholesale change to the community solar rule. And after that, a formal process will commence, and we anticipate a decision sometime in mid-2026 that may include cost sharing. So that's really what it is. I will just say that when we did a survey of the community solar projects, which were adding a big burden onto the utility system in order to kind of bring renewable energy to low-income customers, we found that about 36 of the projects had gotten a total amount of $125 million of upgrade cost estimated by the utilities. And we were trying to find ways to buy down that cost to the community through the Solar for All grant, but you all know where that's at right now. The last thing I want to say is thank you very much to the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory and the other national labs. The I2X program has been very beneficial to New Mexico because our utilities and interveners do not have the technical capacity that the labs bring to helping analyze hosting capacity or other things. If you want to ask me about that during the session, I'll be happy to talk about it. With 25 seconds to go, I'm going to turn it back.
Well done.
Kate.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Great presentation. All right, next up, we have Ron Nelson, who's a partner with the Current Energy Group.
Stop sharing.
Ron,
I need to stop sharing.
Yeah.
Where's my sharing? Oh, there it is. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur. All right, Ron, when you're ready, you can pull up your slides.
All right, can you see my slides all right?
Yeah, over to you.
All right, good morning and afternoon, everyone. I'm Ron Nelson. I'm a partner with Current Energy Group. Current Energy Group is a clean energy consulting firm that works across most stakeholders in the regulatory domain, including commissions, consumer advocates, a few utilities, as well as working with the DER community. So I will be talking to you about the Maryland cost allocation method, or the MCAM, as well as export tariffs. The Maryland, some quick background on both of these. The MCAM came out of a interconnection work group in Maryland that I participated in and worked closely with the group leader on developing the Maryland cost allocation method. The one asterisk I will put on this is that there was a proposal done in the interconnection work group, and the EDCs in Maryland have a filing coming up that will put more specificity to how the methodology will be implemented in Maryland, or how it will be proposed to be implemented. So that process is still ongoing. And then export tariffs are, I'll get into more detail around what they are, but they've been implemented in Australia to deal with high DER penetrations and to equitably recover costs from exporting facilities, as well as thoughtfully integrate them through planning processes and forecasting. So we've kind of already gone over this at a high level, but I wanted to just touch on what the need for, evolving cost allocation is. And there are several reasons. I'll focus on one that's mostly related to these approaches for cost allocation, and that's free ridership. A lot of times when connecting facilities, connecting exporting facilities, connect to the distribution system, they use a portion or all of the system for free. And that creates perverse incentives for the utility. Doesn't really make them want to connect them. And it creates perverse incentives for the DER because they don't have a price signal to change their behavior and to lower the costs that they are causing to the system at certain times. For example, in April, when there's low load, export can override, it can backflow and create voltage issues that the utility has to address, or it can create backflow through transformers, which the utility has to address. And so that is a cost being caused by exporting facilities, and there's no price signal currently provided to get them to shift that export to a different time of day. And I'm speaking generally. There may be a state that does this. So diving a little deeper into the MCAM. So the slide gives you just how the cost allocation method works at a high level for above 600 volts and below 600 volts. I'm going to talk about a little bit more around what's unique about the MCAM. And what's unique about it is how the connection fee is calculated, so this is basically a twist on pro rata shares. So if a large facility connects to the system and a substation upgrade is needed, the connecting facility will pay a pro rata share of the upgrades it causes, which is a price signal to minimize those costs. And then the remainder of the upgrade costs are then spread across the whole distribution system. And those say the upgrade is 100 million and 5 million goes to the large facility. 95 is then spread all throughout the distribution system, and any connecting facilities pay some portion of that socialized cost when they connect. Now, when you spread it out all over the distribution system, that connection charge becomes very small in most instances. But with the MCAM, the fee is based on hosting capacity scarcity. So we're trying to give not only a price signal to the connecting facility, but price signals to connecting facilities throughout the distribution system that says, whoa, we don't really have hosting capacity on this feeder or substation, and it's going to be expensive to take that remaining, or it's going to be more expensive to take that remaining hosting capacity. You could go connect in a different area and it would be a lower connection fee because those areas have high levels of hosting capacity. So it's trying to give a locational price signal as well as a price signal when you connect. Exactly how this will be done is going to be articulated in some of the EDC's filings. I want to say in January, but I don't know the date off the top of my head. And you know that those price signals achieve the objectives of dealing with free ridership. So you're giving some price signal to modify the export when it creates costs or when it causes costs, and you also lower the burden for those larger costs that are created by single facilities. So that's just at a high level how the MCAM structured. Now we're going into export tariffs. Export tariffs changed the whole paradigm, basically. We no longer put export into the closet and interconnection and treat them differently. We bring exporting facilities and we treat them as customers to the distribution utility. So we charge them ongoing use of system charges, just like any other customer pays. And when you're connecting the customer, they would connect through something similar to a line extension. Line extensions are used for load, and they usually assign a pro rata share of an upgrade that's caused, or they can completely socialize connection costs depending on the line extension tariff. It's really a balance when it comes to connecting load, right? If you pay for something in the line extension, it's removed out of your rates. So you're not double paying. So if you have to upgrade a line transformer, there's a portion of your bill that gets removed when you're load. And so the export tariff treats exporting facilities as a customer. They would get a monthly bill, or they would have a add-on to their overarching bill for behind the meter resources. Again, this is used in Australia, and some of the principles behind it are, again, giving a price signal, allowing that price signal to change as the system changes. It also requires the utility to start planning for export, because the utility has to cost effectively integrate load and then export into the system. And it's an application of these traditional rate making principles that we've used for 120 years for load. We just switch it over and we more symmetrically apply it to export, and with the result of creating a more bidirectional system. So here's an example of an export tariff. I think it can be a little bit noisy when you're first looking at it, but note that the consumption charge is just what people see, what a normal load customer sees on their bill. And then the export reward charge. The key about export tariffs is that you're separating costs and benefits. So this reward could be done through a program, it could be done through a different tariff. It can be done in many ways, which is why export tariffs are also nice, is because they're extremely flexible. And then you have the off-peak charge. This is essentially the core component of the export tariff. That's, if you can't see my mouse, it's the right column, third row. And so in Australia, during high irradiance periods between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. that also have lower net load, you have to pay to export to the system, and that's because it causes costs to export during that time when you have high DER penetrations. So this is based off of an Australian tariff. The key point, though, is not this particular structure of an export tariff, but that an export tariff can vary in every way imaginable, just like a load tariff. You could create a small fixed charge, which is similar to what APS does in Arizona for DER customers. Or you can do a demand charge if you have larger customers. And then you can also differentiate between firm and non-firm export. Mr. Hogan mentioned the dynamic operating envelopes in one of the questions. That would be more of a non-firm export tariff. So talking about some of the benefits about changing over to an export tariff framework, it is really, I think if you think about this, the way that we deal with export is very bespoke in many states. And we've developed a process for load that is very streamlined over the last 120 years. And I think a good example that you can look at the juxtaposition with how we treat load and export differently is that you've got data centers. Everybody wants to connect a data center, not so much for the exporting facilities. And that's because there's a perverse incentive. So some of the benefits are that the utility has to plan. There's a price signal for exporting facilities to increase efficiency. And we can start looking at more co-optimization for imports and exports. And then finally, it starts to address the misaligned incentives that utilities have, because it gives them revenue from the exporting facility, and requires them to take those revenues and plan to a least cost future for those exporting facilities, and more thoughtfully integrate hosting capacity into their forecasting and planning processes, with the agreement that they get to assign those costs to exporting facilities. And I'll leave you with my closing thoughts written. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ron. Really appreciate that presentation. All right, well, that concludes our presentations, and now we get to dig into our discussion. A big thank you to all of our panelists for these really informative presentations, provided a deep dive into very complex technical issues. We'll be getting into Q&A and discussion, so panelists, you can all turn on your videos. Before we dig into these questions, I'm going to launch a quick poll to our audience. So you'll be able to put your answer in the chat. So the question is, what changes are being considered to DER interconnection cost allocation in your jurisdiction or jurisdictions you've worked in? If you want to go ahead and start putting in some responses in your chat.
And while we're waiting for the responses, let me ask a question to Ron. Is there a date by which the Maryland EDCs are expected to file their MCAM implementation methodologies?
I want to say it was January 1st, but I could be wrong. I can see if I can get that information.
Maybe if you have like a docket number, case number, you could put it in the chat, that'd be great.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to give a couple more seconds for folks to respond. Getting a couple of answers in Q&A. Flat fee changes include using more proactive cost allocation system than the current reactive one. The Texas PUC is initiating an evaluation of current methodology used to charge wholesale transmission costs to distribution providers as mandated in Senate Bill 6. Thank you for sharing. We have cost sharing MCAM. Illinois recently made changes through regulation and has ongoing interconnection working group. All right, feel free to keep responding in the chat. I'm going to turn to our next poll question, and then we'll dig into our discussion. All right, so this question you should all see is, what models of cost allocation have been most effective at improving efficiencies? And you'll have multiple choice answers.
And to keep the conversation going, I'm going to ask a question to Ron. Where does the export energy go? Is the customer serving load or selling energy in the system?
So it could be either. Is the short answer. In Australia, most of these the export tariffs has largely been applied to behind the meter resources. And the reason for that is they have one national market. So they're trying to not create perverse price signals for the exporting facilities. However, I've worked with some of the Australian utility folks down there and discussed applying them to front of the meter facilities in the US. And it seems feasible and reasonable to do so, given that you have the jurisdictional divide between retail and wholesale that is already kind of creating some perverse incentives or inefficient market outcomes potentially.
Great, thanks.
All right, thanks all to who responded to our poll. So it looks like from the responses that we received that the majority of participants have a combination of different approaches from initial cost causer pays, cost cap, or fixed fee. And the second most common is the pro rata cost sharing. And lastly, rate basing. Thank you all for responding to our polls. Now we can dig into some of our questions. So to our panelists, what approaches are your states or jurisdictions or states you've worked in using to account for benefits in order to appropriately allocate DER interconnection costs to beneficiaries? Do you see increasing alignment across parties in how to distribute benefits and costs of distribution system upgrades for DER? So I will go ahead and turn to Brian first, if you want to weigh in.
Thank you very much. So yeah, we've definitely seen a lot of movement in Massachusetts on how we're handling all this, right? I don't think that's a surprise, given what I was discussing earlier. We have such a high saturation of DG or DER in the Commonwealth that it eventually got to the point where cost causation works great until it doesn't, right? And then when it fails pretty miserably. So I think everybody was pretty engaged in getting on board with various discussions we had on how we were going to allocate these costs. And for benefits, Massachusetts has some pretty lofty goals and targets for clean energy. As I mentioned earlier, we are currently in the midst of a clean energy transition and transitioning away from natural gas. So really our goals and targets are more of what we're striving for at this point.
Thank you. Arthur, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, as I indicated, that New Mexico is really kind of at the beginning of this journey, and we don't have firm policies on that. I will say that in terms of trying to assess the costs and the benefits, we really are looking at a cost benefit analysis in distribution upgrade planning by the utilities. And as I indicated, we have a rule under consideration that's moving towards that. With regard to eligibility, so far it's really been about community solar. It's been adding community solar into the utility system. And so kind of like every action that the commission has taken has been in response to that. So you have to be selected as a community solar project, and you have to kind of go through an interconnection study to see where you are, and then come to the commission if you're asking for this. So let's just say it's a work in progress.
Thank you, Arthur. Ron, do you want to weigh in too? And I'm going to add in another question to all, if you want to weigh in also on the mechanisms that have helped facilitate alignment in cost sharing proceedings. What experiences have you had so far?
So, I spent a lot of my time litigating the details of these, so I see pretty deep into the methodologies. I think the first and foremost, we should be prioritizing flexible connections. We should be trying to not build the system to the peak. This is true for, oh, did I lose people?
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. We shouldn't be building to the peak, right? This is for load and for export, but Australia, almost all export connections are non-firm now. UK load connections, non-firm. We're very far behind on this, and it's costing a lot of money. So that is a form of cost allocation, right? And then when it comes to the big pieces of cost allocation approaches, it's really the decision of whether exporting facilities upgrades should be socialized to ratepayers. And I think there are good ways to do that and bad ways. And I think that we just have to be careful with how much risk we're shifting from developers to ratepayers. And so, if you're trying to make a calculation that's counting on a certain amount of solar connecting over 20 years, that's a big risk to put on the back of ratepayers when that doesn't show up because of changing market dynamics, changing policy landscape. And so I'm not seeing like a lot of convergence necessarily. And I still think it's a pretty early stage in a lot of the conversations.
Thank you for that. And that really touches on kind of the second aspect of the question. I don't know, Brian or Arthur, if you want to have anything else to add just on lessons learned from your experience in Massachusetts and New Mexico on mechanisms that have helped or that are currently facilitating different parties with very different priorities aligning on cost sharing proceedings.
If I may just promote the stakeholder engagement and working group process. I think that is the most effective way to try and bring people together. And I can say that when we started 4.5 years ago, we had what I call vociferous opposition from the utilities. And those engineers were very concerned about reliability, and they've retired, and a new generation of utility engineers has come in that are much more receptive to this. So what we found was identify the internal champions for doing this and get them into your process, because they will help carry the message back to the utility, reduce the thing. We haven't been sued over any of these policies yet, although that was a common happenstance. 5 years ago, the commission was always getting sued for every decision. So far, we've avoided that. So I think that we've made some progress.
And just building out there, we all started somewhere, right? So while I'm going over some things that may seem they're a bit at a higher level, we were once in your shoes as well. So I definitely want to also mention Ron's remarks that I agree with. Unfortunately, I can't speak too much, I think, about flexible interconnection because we do have an open proceeding before the department right now. So beyond that, I will say that I do agree with the fact that flexible interconnections can reduce the amount of investment that has to get put forth to accommodate all these resources. And I think one of the things that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has really have front of mind right now certainly is affordability for ratepayers, right? So as we continue to go down this path, one of the things that we have to be cognizant of is the speed of adoption that we're undertaking, right? So, I mean, I do this in jest, but we could do this all in a month, right? If we do that, it's going to be super, super expensive. So, we could also take 30 years to do this, and that's going to be not really quick enough to really, provide a lot of benefits to us. So what is the correct pace that we're doing this at to balance both the benefits that we will receive from these facilities with making it affordable for customers? And that's where I think Ron's comments about flexible interconnections really come into play.
Thank you. That's really insightful. Lisa, do we want to take a couple audience questions?
Yeah, we have a lot of great questions. Let's start with a not so easy one. This is really open to any of you. Does DER cost allocation differ depending on sort of the use case? Whether the DER is installed to provide distribution services or is being installed on the distribution network to provide wholesale services or participate in wholesale markets? And then, you can go from there about which rules apply, state versus federal.
Did you want to call on one of us, or do you just want us to chime in?
Why don't you go first?
Cost causation's cost causation, right? You got to pay the cost that you're causing from my perspective. We talk about beneficiary pays, but at FERC, most beneficiary pays principles are still, they come through methodologies that look at load. It's either your peak or it's your load. That is how you're measuring that benefit. You're not really getting away from how you're utilizing the grid when we talk about benefits. And so I think that you're kind of dealing with it similar ways, whether you're using the distribution system. Either way, you might be causing different costs based on the services you're providing, which would need to be reflected.
Do we have other perspectives here on whether DER cost allocation should differ based on, what level of the system the DER is ultimately providing service? All right.
We don't have any case studies on that, but looming is the great interest of utilities adding new large load facilities like data centers, for instance, that will absolutely require upgrades. Usually they would pay for the whole kit and caboodle, but some of the upgrades are more than necessary. And so we're going to have to come up with a mechanism, basically. But we do recognize that really a kind of analysis that has never really been done at our level before is going to be necessary.
All right. Let me go to a couple questions that I think we can answer pretty quickly. First, how do we determine pro rata allocation share for each participant when we're using such methods? Brian, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so when we're evaluating projects in a group study or a cluster study, we'll say, we would take the pro rata based upon your contribution to the overall impact. That's how we would separate that out. So specifically in Massachusetts, where we do have the provisional program, we are sharing costs between ratepayers and the developers. But within the developers, as that cost for that upgrade is being attributed to that group, it will then be allocated based upon whatever percentage your share is of those necessary upgrades.
Any differences elsewhere? Folks want to jump in? It sounds pretty straightforward. And then one quick one for Ron. How is use determined? I think this goes to like the export tariff. Is it, coincident peak, non-coincident peak? Is there some other determinant?
Just like a load tariff, you could make it either way. It's, I think NCP demand, you're potentially, if it's a behind the meter resource, you're looking at double counting issues. So you might want to lean volumetric when you're looking at behind the meter resources. And the only asterisk I will include in my previous response that's related to this is you have to vary your cost allocation and recovery based on the sophistication of who you're sending that price signal to.
All right, great. This is a question for Arthur. Arthur, I don't know if you have the answer. It's a pretty nitty accounting question. Does the energy generated by community solar get charged under FERC account 5555?
No, we have made the conscious decision that community solar projects are not qualifying facilities under FERC rules. That would have added a whole different level of essentially regulation about them that we just did not want to get into because it would have kind of really killed the program in the cradle. So no.
All right, great. And another quick one for Ron. Are there US jurisdictions that have or are considering export tariffs like you discussed?
Well, I've proposed them in several jurisdictions. So, I mean, there's talks in Illinois, I proposed them in Massachusetts. And so the other area that sort of does it is Arizona. APS does a cost service study with DG in it, and has basically a higher fixed charge for DERs. I don't know that is necessarily implemented in the same way I would think of an export tariff framework, but it is a component of it.
Does anybody else, Arthur, Brian, have thoughts on the potential for possible future adoption of export tariffs, either in your state or maybe elsewhere? You think it's a promising approach?
We've had discussions about it, as I alluded in the community solar rule update, but I don't see it in the foreseeable future. And I do have a question for Ron about this whole export tariff thing.
Oh,
If I can, or if we can
yes,
wait
please.
until. Okay. Ron, you mentioned that both the AU and the UK are now only connecting load on a non-firm basis. In the United States, generally, our utilities have an obligation to serve. It seems like it's conflicting. Is that a necessary precondition for moving to an export tariff, or is that just something that's aligned with it?
It is something that is aligned with it. We've been connecting non-firm loads since the 70s. That's what an interruptible tariff is at the transmission and generation level. All you're doing with flexible connections is you're bringing that concept to the distribution level. So there's no obligation to serve violation there. And as you can see with the processes for data centers, SPP and PJM are both moving towards flexible connections for that load. Or at least they're considering it. SPP's done it as further along. And so this is a similar concept. The other thing is that most states are looking at flexible, well, maybe versions of flexible connections through their interconnection working groups. Like Illinois, pretty far along. There's going to be active network management options. There's going to be export limitations. Those are all just different flavors of flexible connections.
Thank you.
Letha, you're on mute.
Thank you. Let me do one more question here. Have you considered in your states, or do you think your states might be interested in using dynamic operating envelopes where new connections would have an option of having their use of the grid be subject to time shifting, rather than requiring new capacity investment? Is any activity happening in your states, or do you see it on the horizon? Or Ron, elsewhere as you scan the country?
I would just, maybe I can start and they can fill in with their states. Dynamic operating envelopes are primarily applied to smaller systems, in my experience. So you need to map the low voltage distribution system, which most utilities in the US have not. And because you're giving signals to not overload the secondary system. And then with the large, more community solar, which is really triggering a lot of the cost sharing discussion, that is more of a DERMS, active network management solution, as opposed to a dynamic operating envelope, in my experience. So you have two different use cases for the different sizes of facilities, but similar concepts.
Ryan or Arthur, any comments here?
Well, just the commission doesn't have a firm policy on it, but we do understand that utilities are discussing with interconnection applicants the way to prevent export into their system in that critical low load period, right? The 6 a.m. to essentially 8 a.m. And I believe that there are some agreements between utilities and some new larger customers that might be providing some of their own energy in order to prevent that export during that period, but there's no firm policy.
And in Massachusetts, we have an open docket, open proceeding right now for energy storage system operational parameters tariff. And in that docket, we are exploring dispatch limiting schedules, which are exactly what Ron was describing earlier. And additionally, or at least anecdotally, we do anticipate the EDCs obtaining DERMS by kind of late end of year 2026. So both of those, kind of to Ron's point again, I think both of those will be working in concert together to help limit upgrades and avoid some costs. And then that's, again, cost allocation, right? Avoiding cost and cost allocation. And then moving forward with that, right? So how we can make this more affordable for customers.
All right, let's go back to Kathryn.
All right, thank you. So kind of bigger picture question, and you all have touched on this in some way, but thought it'd be helpful as kind of a guiding the discussion is, what was the trigger in the states that you've worked in that considered and tested, that kind of triggered the consideration and testing of alternatives to the traditional cost, cause, or pays model, and why have the states you're working in or your state considered an alternative to cost, cause, or pays model? And thinking through back to many years ago when this first came up.
So Kathryn, I guess I'll start. As I kind of alluded to, or as I stated earlier, in fact, cost causation worked great until it didn't, right? So we were in a position in Massachusetts to where we needed to make a change. We needed to take action because we are in this transition, and we are very open and accommodating to increasing the amount of clean energy we have on our system. So in order to get there, we had to come up with something new. So that's where we're at. And so far, we're still navigating it through it, and we're still reviewing and issuing CIP orders and so on. But so far, it does seem to be a significant shift, and it seems to be a welcome shift. Yeah.
Arthur, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, as I alluded, it really started with the desire to update the interconnection rule, which had last been updated in 2007 and was very much based on FERC interconnection policies, which were just proving inadequate for the new situation in which utilities were getting applications from rooftop solar applicants and then community solar. So we really we're at a situation where the state knows that its infrastructure is outdated and that the policies that guide the new planning for infrastructure are outdated. And so we're just trying to take a step-by-step approach. In upgrading interconnection, I was one of the drivers on getting there. And our goal was really not to bring us up to 2022, but to give us a rule that would be good for another 10 years, because I know it's going to be 10 years before we revisit the rules. So we were really looking ahead and trying to incorporate what we could in that rule. In this case, it really just amounted to opening a door rather than having a full-fledged policy.
Thanks for that. Ron, do you want to take a stab at this one as well? at least for the jurisdictions you worked in?
I find it a little bit challenging to move to kind of a more beneficiary pays paradigm in the current paradigm, because I think where you run into challenges is we're making 50-year investments and we charge DG upfront fees to connect. And so that creates a misalignment between cost allocation and cost recovery from a timing perspective. And you're not really reflecting the usage of the system as it changes over time, and you're not collecting those revenues based on how the system's being used and customers benefit. And so you just get that risk created because of that misalignment. And so that's one of the big challenges I see of how we currently price connections for export. And most states are leaning on that beneficiary pays concept to quantify that fee.
I'm going to follow up with you on this, and this is certainly applicable to Arthur and Brian to answer as well for Massachusetts, New Mexico. But what are the methods that are being used to determine who benefits from the upgrade and devising that reimbursement strategy?
So, and Brian can correct me if I'm wrong, but in Massachusetts, they use a demand assessment to quantify electrification benefits for residents. So they have like EV demand, electrification or heating demand, and that's all forecasted out to 2050, stacked on top of each other. And that's like the ratepayer benefit. There's also reliability benefits and asset condition benefits. They're very subjective from my perspective. And they are based on a lot of assumptions with varying degrees of credibility. And so that's where I get a lot of challenge for committing into this, like jumping into a beneficiary pays process that is a subjective exercise when we're talking about over $1 billion of upgrades.
Thank you. Yeah, Brian, go ahead.
So I don't think I have much to add because Ron just kind of summarized or encapsulated what we have going on in Massachusetts. And I think he did so accurately. But I want to make sure that when we're talking about this, we do have multiple other proceedings going on. As I mentioned, we have a grid mod, we have electric sector modernization plans, in addition to our CIP proceeding. So they all kind of work collaboratively to get together, right? Again, part of it, we have a long-term system planning proposal. We also have a flexible interconnection component. So really trying to look at this more holistically to try to plan the system and where we're going to get to. The one thing I think I disagree with on Ron's statement is the reliability benefits, just given the intermittency of some specific DERs, right? So we know that PV actually can create some reliability issues given its intermittency, specifically when there's quickly moving clouds, right? Because you're going switching back and forth between import and export very quickly. But other than that, I think he hit the nail on the head. So thank you very much, Ron.
Yeah, I'll just say that in New Mexico, it's not so much the mechanisms because they haven't been developed, but targeting low-income communities as needing upgrades for a whole host of reasons, for economic development, for just their ability to access renewable energy, for any kind of energy management. So it's more about trying to direct the utilities to put infrastructure and applicants to move into places where it helps more people than just themselves. Talk to me again in a couple of years. We'll see how it works out.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that kind of triggers another question around group study and cluster study processes. Some of you have mentioned this, particularly Brian and Arthur, on how these are being used as alternative cost sharing mechanisms. Can you comment at all on how these processes have changed and improved the economic efficiency in Massachusetts and New Mexico, for example?
Again, come back to me when we have results.
Okay.
I think there's certainly for the DPU, I think there's an administrative burden that's taken off of us when you start putting groups of projects together, and we have to review these things specifically through a filing from the EDC. But I think there's other economic benefits that come along from this as well, specifically on the EDC side, right? So as they're kind of proceeding, you're not doing this sequentially, you're not doing just one right after the next. You're going to get efficiencies that come in from doing one study that might be bigger than your initial study you would have done, but it's not the equivalent of doing 5 sequential studies either, right? So you're getting savings in both money and time there, because in Massachusetts, we do have timeline enforcement mechanisms, which can be altered given agreements with EDC, but the companies are expected to process and progress these studies within a very specific amount of time. So again, in Massachusetts, we're trying to bring on a significant amount, or we're continuing to bring on a significant amount of distributed energy resources in a relatively confined amount of time.
All right, thank you. Lisa, do we want to take a couple more audience questions?
Yeah, that'd be great. We have a lot of good questions. What tools can we use to determine the cost allocations, specifically for cost allocation, cost sharing methodologies? Are there certain tools that the utilities or commissions are using?
There is no specific software tool that we're using. We are in Massachusetts evaluating proposals that are coming in, both from the EDCs, but also from other stakeholders that are submitting counter proposals. And we're taking all those, evaluating them, and obviously creating a record of evidence, and then using that to evaluate ultimately which proposal we will advance or modify or reject, but really advance or modify in an issue via order.
Anyone else?
You can integrate these concepts into a cost of service model, which is just Excel based most of the time. You can also do power flow to inform cost allocation.
Okay, totally different. How does FERC Order 2222 align with efforts to improve cost allocation? Is there a need for more multi-state or multi-utility or other geographic coordination at the regional level?
I think so. In Massachusetts, again, we are a bit of a victim of our own success. So we've, I think, progressed and built out our system at a different rate than our neighboring other states in New England. And that's fine, right? It's totally fine. But I think once you start getting into a situation like we are in Massachusetts, and now Massachusetts representing roughly 50% of the load in New England also, right? So not only the big load, we're also the big DG hub. So I think as you start to progress this, ICE New England at the end of the day is really the arbiter of the transmission system. So as we now have impacts that reach beyond the distribution system and onto the transmission system, it's very important for them to be engaged. Obviously, they're going to perform their affected system operator studies. And just by the nature of the ASOs, they're going to be contacting other affected system operators. So I think engaging with folks, I'm a big fan of kind of stakeholder process and engaging with other people in general. But I think, yeah, I think it benefits you regionally if you start to get together and start thinking this through, particularly if you're vertically integrated state, it may be a different conversation, but in a restructured state like Massachusetts, I think it's good for the other states to kind of come together. Hey, this is where we're getting to, kind of work collaboratively with the transmission system operator, so they know what's going on, and then and go from there.
Great. Arthur or Ron, any other thoughts here?
Well, I'll just say that traditionally New Mexico has been kind of a stagnant eddy in the utility system, but our utilities are now joining the day-ahead markets. There's two that are coming from the west, the California Independent System Operator, EDAM, and the Southwest Power Pool. When you're a member of an organized market, then you have to start paying attention to FERC, right? And that's definitely part of the ongoing conversation. We have 2 of our 3 utilities have chosen to go with the SPP model, and PNM has gone with the California Independent System Operator. They still interconnect with each other. They're still going to be responsible for many of the state policies, but now there's that overlay of conforming with FERC rules, like incorporating distributed generation into your resources. So we'll see how that works out. But I think by next year we should have full memberships.
Ron, any thoughts?
I would say yes. We need uniform processes to prevent inefficient market outcomes. You're going to see that you're seeing this at the transmission level with data centers. You see it other ways. The other concrete example is wholesale distribution access tariffs for storage. Storage has to pay for load either on a retail tariff or a wholesale tariff. Make sure you compare them and make sure that they're not paying different amounts for load at the wholesale versus the retail level, because they're often calculated differently.
All right, we've had a few comments over the webinar about some analogies on the transmission side. And so one of them that was brought up was the renewable energy zones that we did in California and in the West, where there's some anticipatory investments. And are there any meaningful differences there with these cost allocation methodologies that charge the triggering facility on the DER interconnection side only its share of the total cost, with the rest recovered over time as new facilities interconnect? Because in some ways it does sound an awful lot like the successful model that we had in Texas, the West, California on the transmission side.
I would just note, like in Massachusetts, I think the SIPs have been more reactive, but there's the long-term system planning process that is essentially looking more to replicate that type of a process more proactively. So to identify areas that are identified as high probability for development for renewable energy. So almost exactly the same is my interpretation participating in the work groups.
I think that's a fair
Brian?
assessment. I think Ron made a fair assessment. I don't have anything to add.
Nothing to add.
All right, another question that came up is, going to, I think Ron at least mentioned, utilities not wanting to interconnect the DER facilities if they're not paying, for their costs, if they're just free riding on investments that are already included in the rate base, and they're losing revenue. So the question is generally, why are we not seeing states examine some kinds of regulatory options to neutralize the capital bias in the traditional utility model? One that was mentioned here in the question is the TOTEX option that's used like in the UK, for example.
That's a very good question. I think the having worked on a lot of the PBR processes in the US, I think what you're looking at is that initial rate shock to having a return on expenses. And when the UK went from traditional regulation to RIIO the first time, its regulatory staff went from 300 to 800. And state staffs are not going to see that type of an increase. And I mean, I think that's a shame, because I think that's exactly what needs to happen to effectively regulate through a PBR or TOTEX paradigm. It's a resource issue, I think, is what it comes down to largely, and a prioritization issue for legislators and regulators.
Anyone else want to jump in here?
We have a chair that just moved on from the department at the end of last week, and boy, I'll tell you, capital bias would have been his bread and butter to have a conversation with you right now. But keeping that in mind, recognizing that the department has had some conversations with NGED. I'm not sure if you're familiar with NGED. That's National Grid's DSO operator in the UK. So we've had a few meetings with them just to get a sense of what it is and what's going on, and try to get a better sense of, obviously CapEx, OpEx, and then TOTEX, which you're talking about now. So I don't have anything more to add than that, other than kind of internal conversations, exploring it, so on.
I'll just say that the big challenge that I see going forward is because of the recognition that adding new modern resources, even though they are cost effective compared to even things that are in the ground and operating, brings on new costs. New costs scare the hell out of regulators, right? And in New Mexico, because it is a largely impoverished state, rate affordability has now become a #1 priority. So cost sharing, while it seems like a really good way to go forward, does hit resistance because you're putting some of a cost onto ratepayers who have other things that they have to spend their money on and not a whole lot of money to go around. So that's the battle that I see coming forward, is how you balance this and how you make these cost sharing mechanisms equitable for everybody.
There's one more question, and I am not sure that I am clear about it. The question is, how do you account for the availability cost incurred by customers with just-in-time power demands? And I'm assuming that they're trying to match their, they're trying to match electricity supply with their real-time or near real-time demand. They might want to purchase, renewable resources in the market. I don't know if there's any special considerations that question prompts for you. Thinking about customers when this is about DER interconnection. So thinking about customers that are interconnected to the distribution or subtransmission system that may have strategies, wanting to, have 24/7, renewable energy, for example. Is there any special consideration here with respect to cost allocation?
Not so much cost allocation, but there is a very large meta facility, farm down in Los Lunas, and they have a mix. They have a mix of utility provided energy, of special contracts that are exclusive to them that the utility just delivers, and also are building solar projects and storage around their facility. So that gives them the flexibility. And so what it would help out is that as their load changes, they can have control over their resources because they can just shut off their local. So that's kind of working right now. We haven't had any problems with it, and it seems to be an acceptable way of dealing with that. We don't have that many kind of those customers, right? And there are a couple more, but many of them are going to Texas instead of New Mexico.
If I'm interpreting the question correctly, which I may not be, my mind goes to behind the meter resources, and the issue becomes a really technical one with how the utilities are modeling and integrating behind the meter resources into their planning. And it is related to what Mr. Hogan was saying about like what is utilization. And from my perspective, it should be net load, and you should not be using the nameplate capacity of behind the meter resources in your distribution system planning modeling. That's not true for most utilities. They're using the nameplate capacity and modeling worst case scenarios of that behind the meter generator, and they're not allowing for power control systems or smart inverters to limit export or modify export. And so it comes down to the technical details around what is allowable in a state and how that should impact the cost allocation.
Great. Thanks. Back to you, Kathryn.
Oh, Brian, you were going to jump in there.
Oh, no. I was just going to say that I think Ron gave a great answer. I think the system is built for just-in-time electric delivery if you take storage out of the statement, right? So once you add storage in, then obviously it becomes a different story. One of my colleagues likes to equate it to the old milk delivery system, right? There used to be a person driving around in a vehicle, would drop off a container of milk for you. You would have it, you would use it when you need to, right? Electricity obviously is much different than that. It gets delivered when you flip the switch, and it then obviously illuminates the light. So yeah, in the world of energy storage, that's a much different conversation.
Thank you. That's helpful. And this relates a little bit to this answer is looking at complementary approaches. So what are some additional approaches, such as coordination with grid planning or how nameplate capacity is dealt with, that support more economically efficient cost allocation models? And so, Kate talked about proactive planning in her presentation. Brian, you talked about the ESMP process. Do you want to add anything more about how this changes how costs are shared across beneficiaries and what kind of innovations you would say could improve economic efficiency to make the process more timely and fair?
Yeah. So clearly, we have a very large undertaking in Massachusetts to build out this system here. It's going to be expensive. It's going to take a while, but we did, at least for the CIPs, put constraints around how long the company would have to build out those upgrades related to that CIP. So we do have some concern for type and obviously, for time and obviously for cost as well. But as we continue down this road, I think it really starts getting into some of the conversations we've already had about flexible interconnections. How could those facilities be compensated or made whole, right? So you start talking about, again, a DSO potentially, and then you can get the system operating to provide really the clean energy benefits that you're aiming for without overbuilding a system, as kind of Ron was alluding to earlier, without the additional price tag that also comes along with that.
Ron, do you want to respond as well?
Sure. I think I go back to, we have to think about it as a roadmap, and I think proactive planning's pretty far near the end, right? So you need to be starting with transparent regulatory processes and ensuring that the utilities are already doing best practices before we start talking about proactive investment. Are they doing flexible connection? Do they have transparent distribution system planning processes already under scrutiny and review from stakeholders? Because if you don't and you skip to proactive planning, there's a lot of details that get lost into how they're determining proactive planning upgrades. And so we want to make sure we're building the foundation before we take a jump into proactive planning. And there's a lot of things that regulators can be having utilities do that are pretty basic things that you're not seeing currently, that could be done better within the regulatory process.
Yeah, that's
before you jump to proactive.
Yeah, that's a good reminder on 1.0 versus 2.0. Arthur, do you want to weigh in here?
No, I'll just echo what Ron had said earlier, is that the utility has to plan. And we were in a situation where, while our utilities did internal distribution planning, they did not share that with the commission. We did not know what their plans were. And when we started looking at how they were actually doing, we were finding that it was a very limited approach based on load, and load hadn't changed in 7 years, right? So there was really no real proactive to it. Now, electrification, incorporation of renewable energy, all of those things are demanding a higher level of analysis from the utilities about their own systems. And we're looking forward to matching that with the state policies. So that's really where we are right now.
All right, thank you so much. I have one final question. Just lessons learned from your state on getting this process started, whether that's starting the discussion about alternative cost sharing mechanisms or starting a working group. What's the one lesson learned that you'd like to share with our audience?
If you're a commission staffer, right, make sure that you have a commissioner that's fully behind this, because if they don't understand it, and if it's new to them, they're going to be very skeptical about the costs that are involved in it. So you need both an internal champion in your agency, and, as I indicated, find the people in the utility who are the next generation of leaders who have an interest in this, because then they're far more willing to negotiate and to come up with compromises that work for the utility. That's really important. We don't want to impose things on the utilities anymore, right? Unless we absolutely have to. We have to get their cooperation. So that, to me, is the key.
Thanks, Arthur. Brian, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's probably pretty clear from this conversation today that there's like lots of work going on in this area, right? So I would recommend folks, if you're an EDC, contact one of your neighboring EDCs. If you're a state utilities regulator, contact one of your neighboring states, right? Talk to them and find out what they have going on in their state also. See where you're aligned, see what you can work on together. But as you're navigating yourself down this path, again, echoing something that Ron said earlier, having a transparent process, having a robust stakeholder process, getting people involved and engaged, getting their buy-in on these as you're making these significant changes is hugely important. I think that one of the couple lessons that we've learned recently is the fee waiver that I went over earlier in my presentation, right? We implemented a lot of things that on paper seemed great, but then we got kind of to where the rubber meets the road right now, certainly given the current economic climate and everything else, we found that the standard fee structure that we had in place really was going to become untenable, and we wanted to better align when costs were going to be received by the EDC to align with when those costs were going to be expended for those pieces of equipment to build the upgrades necessary for their project. So, maybe you can avoid a tariff waiver, possibly if you think this through a little bit more, or at least learn from your neighboring states.
Thank you. That's great advice. Ron, any final advice for the audience?
I would just say in the regulatory space, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. We need to be implementing comprehensive, durable, long-term solutions that are going to work over time and iteratively. And making sure that we do that as opposed to creating kind of one-off processes that can be modified repeatedly will in the end be faster. And we see a lot of different approaches throughout the US because we're still trying to find a pathway, but everything takes a long time in the regulatory space. And so shying away from comprehensive solutions is something I would recommend against.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panel. Really, really interesting presentations and discussion. Many thanks to our sponsor, to support from the Department of Energy and I2X. Thank you to our audience for joining today and your great discussion and questions. With that, I'm going to end our recording. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be well.